Okay. So it's my first time speaking on this, so I hope my voice is okay. With that awkward beginning, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for being here as we welcome Sara Hossain to the chamber. Please give her a round of applause. So my name is Kate, and I'm an MPhil student in Development Studies. I'm also the Women's and Non-Binary Officer for the Lent term, where I work with our Equalities Officer, David Kwan. A bit more about our guest today. Sara Hossain is a barrister and has been practicing for 30 years in the areas of constitutional, corporate, and family law. Although listing Sara's accomplishments would take the entire evening, I'll give a brief attempt. Sara is a senior advocate of the Supreme Court of Bangladesh and bencher of Middle Temple. Her coursework before the Supreme Court of Bangladesh includes litigation on equality and non-discrimination, the right to liberty, forced marriage, child abduction, and freedom of expression, among others. Additionally, Sara was appointed by the President of the UN Human Rights Council to investigate international human rights issues, including the Gaza protests of 2018 and crimes against humanity in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Lastly, Sara was awarded the International Women of Courage Award from the United States Secretary of State in 2016. Before we begin, I want to give a brief note about today's format. So as the event's organizer, I asked our Equalities Officer, whom I introduced earlier, to co-chair this event with me today because equalities work, both within the union as well as outside in the larger world, is a team effort. No one can do it alone. And too often what happens is issues get siloed. So because I'm Women's and Non-Binary Officer, naturally I'm going to work around issues of gender inclusion, and someone else will be working on something else, and there will be no communication between us. However, I believe that the issues we will discuss today, that is Sara's accomplishments advancing human rights, as well as the larger issue of violence against women in society, these issues concern us all. And similarly, building a world without violence against women and other gender minorities will also require contributions from women, men, and non-binary folks alike. So thank you, David, for agreeing to be on board, and I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thank you very much, Kate, and thank you all for coming. So the format today will be Sara will start with the presentation, then we've prepared a few questions and we would like to open up the floor so that you guys can engage. And Sara, welcome again, and the floor is yours.
Thanks ever so much. Thank you, David, and thank you, Kate, both of you, for organizing this. I'm not so sure how many of you here have some familiarity or knowledge of Bangladesh. Can I have some hands up so I can have an idea? Ideas of people who know a little bit, like high up? I can't see very well, so you have to wave your hands really high up. Your hand is somewhat wavering. You just learned a lot in the last half an hour. Got it. All right. Great. Thank you. So I've been given a very freewheeling kind of brief. And as a lawyer, I guess we're very used to speaking with whatever we're told to do in the last 5 minutes. So I'm going to try and just narrow it down a little bit so that those of you who didn't raise your hands don't feel completely out of the loop. I was asked basically to speak about my work. But that is a lot of years and would require you all to spend your Saturday night here, which doesn't seem like a good idea. So I'm going to restrict it a little bit. And one of the things we do a lot in Bangladesh is observe different days, right? It's called day observation. So I think in that spirit, I'm going to note the fact that we are currently still sort of commemorating 50 years of our independence from 1971, and maybe use that as a basis to tell you a little bit more about Bangladesh for those of you who are not familiar with it, and for those of you who are, perhaps ask some questions that are part of our common conversations in Bangladesh as well. So Bangladesh became independent in 1971 in a very unusual way, through a war of liberation, through a genocide, through mass sexual violence that people suffered. These words perhaps sound less peculiar today, given what we're seeing around the world, and particularly what we're seeing in Ukraine. They have a particular resonance. But when we emerged, and as we hope Ukraine will also emerge, but when we emerged from our struggles into an independent country in December 1971, that was followed within a year with a new constitution. And that constitution was premised not only on that immediate experience of violence and conflict and gross human rights violations, it was also premised on the previous 2.5 decades of experience of discrimination and exclusion based on language and ethnicity and culture. So the constitution that we got was one that had some grand promises. It had a promise of equality and non-discrimination, prohibition of discrimination based on gender, ethnicity, race, language, caste, and place of birth. It was also a constitution that promised us freedom of expression. It promised liberty. It promised the right to life. It promised freedom of religion. And really importantly, it was a constitution that promised secularism. And it did that because we'd come out of an experience of being in the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, which was premised on which was not premised actually on such different notions, but which ended up embodying these notions about identity based on religion. So having come from that moment, the two issues, I think, which I've worked on a lot and which I think at this moment, looking back 50 years, are very important for us, and where we're seeing new struggles and movements. One is around the issue of equality and inclusion and recognition of diversity in terms of, I think, some of the issues that Kate has already spoken about. And the other issue I want to talk about is the right to freedom of expression. And the reason I want to speak about these two issues, firstly, I think they're relevant globally at the moment. They're really part of global conversations as well. But they're issues that are not easy. They're not issues that you just press a button and they get sorted out for you. You have to fight for these rights, and there's massive contestations, and there are people who will lose and people who will win. And there are huge questions about power that are also embedded in trying to realize these rights. So let me just give you a few examples around the kind of work we've done in Bangladesh and some of the debates that we have around the issue of the right to equality. Let me talk a little bit about women's rights, because that's an area I've really focused on. So as I said, the Bangladesh Constitution promises equality and prohibits discrimination. And the language is quite specific, that the state will not discriminate between men and women. It doesn't recognize in express terms any other gender identity, but there is room for interpretation there. But despite this promise, and despite this new constitution, Bangladesh, of course, also has a history, and that history is a colonial history, right? So not only the Pakistan period history, but of course a much longer period of British imperial history prior to that. So a new shiny constitution has to live with old rusty legislation, not only from the 20th century, which to all of you probably seems a long time ago, but from the 19th century and even earlier than that. So some of the laws that still determine our rights as individuals in Bangladesh today are from the late 19th century. So whether your protection against rape, for example, is determined by a law from 1890, right, 1860, those kinds of years. And as a result, the laws on rape say that only women can be raped. It's not, it's not gender inclusive. The laws on rape say marital rape is not a problem, completely fine to have any kind of forceful sexual intercourse, so long as you've got a bit of paper which says there's a marriage registered in between. In fact, there's a little bit of an exclusion, which is a reminder of the Victorian era, which says that marital rape is a problem and is an offense so long as the wife is aged 13 or under. So recognizing child marriage is a real reality from those days. So those are some of the, and there are laws from those days, evidence laws, which say that women can be questioned about their past sexual history and their character in rape cases as well. There are not only laws, there have been practices left over from those days. So in rape cases, for example, it was the practice until relatively recently that we had something called the two-finger test in place. I see some horrified but familiar-looking recognition of that. So that was, I'm afraid, what it sounds like. The test was that if a forensic doctor could insert two fingers into the vagina of a woman who came in, or a girl who came in complaining of rape, and they found that those fingers could be inserted easily, then they would make a finding that the woman must be habituated to sex and therefore not capable of rape. So this is not Bangladesh's problem alone. The same practice was quite common in India and quite common in Pakistan, and it was kind of recognized in a colonial era textbook called Modi's Forensic Jurisprudence. Not this Modi, needless to be said, and a different Modi from a different era. So that two-finger test, amongst these other provisions in our rape laws, were things that we challenged from the women's movement in Bangladesh and from human rights organizations. They were quite complex challenges to bring forward because we had to look at what was the experience of women who were undergoing two-finger tests, for example. The fact that young children were being subjected to two-finger tests where it was irrelevant, whether they had consented to any sexual act or not. We had to deal with other cases where women were going to police stations to record rape complaints and being turned away on the grounds that the police were saying, well, this didn't happen in our area, so we don't have to listen to them. So these kinds of cases were taken to the courts, one after the other, and we found that our courts have been quite responsive. And in some cases, the legislature has been quite responsive. So in the two-finger test case, for example, we had the court saying clearly that the two-finger test is clearly discriminatory and should be prohibited. And the government followed quite soon after that with a new protocol on investigations of sexual violence where they said under no circumstances should this test be held, clearly consent should be taken and different procedures should be put in place to determine whether there had been any kind of violence or forceful intercourse or non-consensual intercourse, and that should be the basis for determining what goes on with the case. We have a case on right now regarding this question of character evidence in rape cases. We were in court on that last week, and I'm very happy to say that the government appeared and said that they're currently putting through an amendment which will mean that that provision will be repealed. So some progress. So I think these are some of the kinds of issues I wanted to bring forward in terms of how there's a promise of equality, but to realize it, you have to take all sorts of different steps. You have to approach the courts for an interpretation of what that standard means, and you have to look at it in a very specific context. I've talked to you about the issue of rape, but it also is, there's another case that's coming up tomorrow, which is a case of a Hindu woman who is challenging the fact that Hindu person laws and family laws in Bangladesh don't currently allow women to inherit their paternal property or their parental property in certain circumstances. And finally, after 50 years, someone is challenging that, and we're hoping to support her in that case. So this intervention, trying to get judicial interpretations and positive judicial interpretations based on a reflection of the understanding of what people experience because of discrimination is one strategy, but it has to be accompanied always by mobilization outside the courts, speaking to the press, having critical reflections on what the impacts of these kinds of discriminatory policies and practices are, and having people on the streets making it clear that some kind of change has to happen. So those are some of the changes we've seen, I think, in terms of women's rights. But the other issue I just wanted to talk about quickly before we all have a discussion is also around the issue of freedom of expression. This is related also to the issue around women's rights and about addressing discrimination and equality in general. I think when I was a student, or way back when I was starting out in professional life, the way we organized was very much, on the streets, in physical protests and demonstrations and so on. And I'm sure you all do that now as well. But I guess now one of the things you do, which we didn't do in those days, was be very, very active in online space with, critical discourse and engagement and pointing out exactly the problems that you see happening around you. In the Bangladesh context, and the digital space is enormously important because public protest often can be very difficult. It can be very dangerous. And more people are very, very active in online space. But the restrictions on online space, the kind of new legislation we have, legislation which has come after our constitution has promised us the right to freedom of expression, does exactly the opposite. So we have laws. We have a law called the Digital Security Act. We have about to come in place some more new regulations which are going to regulate social media and digital media as well. I think some of the issues that we need to think about in the Bangladesh context are perhaps framed differently to the way perhaps they would be framed for you here in England. Some of the contrasts perhaps are that in this context, you perhaps have a more robust judiciary. You perhaps have problems in terms of seeing social media being a vehicle for disseminating massive levels of disinformation, and social media not regulating different kinds of speech, whether it's not intervening in terms of child sexual abuse, or not intervening in a timely way in terms of political disinformation. In our context, I think we see something rather different, and I have to emphasize that our context means less democratic space, a more authoritarian regime, and very little open public space for political dissent and critical dialogue. So in that space, social media or digital media is really one of the only open spaces we have for critical conversations. And they're regulating this kind of space and putting in laws which say that, for example, you can't say anything which is considered to be hurtful to the image of the nation, where there's no definition of what actually hurts the image of the nation, can be incredibly problematic in terms of shutting down speech. Or saying that you can't say anything which is annoying or insulting to another person. Or to go back to the example I was giving you about restrictions on women's rights, we also have provisions which say that anything which is considered hurtful to religious sentiment. Mind you, this is not blasphemy as such. It's not criticizing a religion. It's anything that is hurtful to religious sentiment or religious values without any description or definition of what religious sentiment or religious values means that if I were to talk, for example, slightly more in more robust terms, even about that case of the Hindu woman who's claiming her right to inheritance, that could be considered to be hurtful to religious sentiments. And you might think I'm being a little bit fanciful, but alas not. Only a few months ago, when a group of women's rights activists, including Hindu women, brought together a proposal to reform Hindu inheritance laws in Bangladesh, they were subjected to, surprise, surprise, criminal cases in our courts saying that they were hurting religious sentiment. And not only that, they were hurting the image of the nation by bringing up these kinds of issues. So in this context, for us, talking about freedom of speech and expression and keeping open digital space and particularly social media space is a really important area to work. Let me just conclude by just giving you a couple of examples of where we've seen that being a challenge and maybe bringing that together with the issue around women's rights. So some of the cases that we're facing in Bangladesh at the moment are precisely around women speaking about how digital space can be threatening for them, can be risky, with threats being made, all kinds of threats in terms of violence, but also threats on their character, personality, trolling, revenge porn, all sorts of things. But we're also seeing women's rights activists who are facing potential prosecutions under our digital security laws for speaking either critically about political issues or simply for speaking about personal issues, but speaking online. So there are two 17-year-old girls at the moment, now 18-year-old girls, who were arrested in Bangladesh during the corona period about 2 years ago, in late 2020. One young Muslim girl aged 17, one young Hindu girl aged 17 at the time, who were arrested for sharing posts on Facebook. Both were held for over a year in juvenile institutions because they were considered to have hurt religious sentiment. Both girls finally got bail from our Supreme Court, but both still today are facing the prospect of prosecution. A university teacher in one of our Bangladesh universities who spoke about attacks on minorities and did share some information, a Facebook post which turned out to be mistaken about a particular attack which hadn't happened, which was from a different period, also faced incarceration for several months. I have a client who's a school teacher who was arrested about 4 years ago because she shared a Facebook post at a time when there were student protests going on around the issue of road safety. She shared a post to try and guide her own students so that they would be safe when they were taking part in these protests, saying if you go out into the streets and you're on a protest, make sure you have some red chili powder in your bag if someone tries to harass you. If the police try and get you, hide behind someone else, be careful, take these following basically, civil disobedience protection measures. This young woman was in her 20s. She was arrested for, again, hurting the image of the nation and provoking deterioration of law and order. She was pregnant at the time. I think she was about 25, 26 at the time. She was held in a police cell overnight, and then she was held for weeks in jail, held on a floor without a bed, and finally got bail after about a month, but is still facing prosecution for sharing that Facebook post. So I'm just sharing these examples again to make clear to you, I think, that it's a thorny path in terms of protection of rights, and why it's important, I think, for us to try and push for more space to be able to speak, for people to be able to kind of demand their rights as in a context where it's very difficult to do and where they face threats to do that. Let me wrap up here now and maybe open up for questions, and hopefully this hasn't seemed too peculiar and from too far away a place, and you can find some points of engagement. Thanks.
Wow, thank you so much, Sara. That was very powerful, and I think the examples you used were excellent. We'd love to return to your work and the themes that you've mentioned, but if you don't mind, it would be great to hear a bit more about your upbringing, your childhood, and what kind of led you to study law and to get involved in what you're doing now. Perhaps I'll give you some prompts, and why don't you share with us where you kind of grew up in the 70s and what kind of influence did your father have on you?
This is the question I usually refuse to answer, okay, but since we're here. So I grew up in Bangladesh until 1974. And my father was a politician and a lawyer, and he came away in 1974 on a brief sabbatical to the other place, to Oxford, and then returned in early 75 to rejoin government at that point, and was on a mission, a state mission abroad to the then Yugoslavia, in August 75, when he got news of this horrific incident which had happened, which was the assassination of our president and almost his entire family, and Bangabandhu Sheikh Mujibur Rahman. My father didn't return to the country for obvious reasons. His four senior-most colleagues and ministers in government were then assassinated, bayoneted to death in jail several months later. So it was and of course, after the assassination was part of a military coup. We were all, my sister, my mother and I were all in Bangladesh at the time, and I was 8. So my father then worked to try and get us out of the country. We left the country, came to Oxford, and we were brought up and lived for several months in a house for all fellows of All Souls College. There were only male fellows and only very elderly fellows at that time. I think they were not used to the idea of having 2 Bangladeshi children under 10 running around in their corridors. So it was a very peculiar time for all of us. But anyway, those years in Oxford, we stayed there for 5 years, and I think that framed actually quite a lot of my thinking and understanding of life. And I then went back to Bangladesh for a couple of years, found it very hard to deal with school in Bangladesh after having a much freer time over here, and insisted I had to come back to England and couldn't cope any longer. And on arriving in England, decided actually I was completely wrong and felt extremely Bangladeshi, needed to go back there right away. So anyway, then I went to university here in Oxford and went back to Bangladesh immediately after that. And I think the most formative time for me, partly it was this history and growing up with this understanding that the coup and the horrors of 75 really informed a lot of pretty much all of our lives until we returned to Bangladesh and afterwards. But when I went back after qualifying as a lawyer here, I went back at an extraordinary moment, which was the end of almost 9 years of military dictatorship, different military dictator by then in the 80s, General Irshad. But I went back in the year when there was a massive movement against him. And I guess I was very lucky. Other people had been, campaigning and struggling and fighting on the streets for 9 years. I got in for the last year, and Irshad fell in December 1990, and it was this, I guess for any of you who've watched all of the kind of Velvet Revolution stuff, even if you're not familiar with Bangladesh, it was this moment of incredible hope. So, Bangladesh is quite a conservative country. Now in 2022, I wouldn't feel very comfortable with my children being out in the street at 1 in the morning. But on the day Irshad fell, we were all in a place called 0 Point in the middle of Dhaka city and singing basically liberation songs and feeling that the world would change dramatically. 30 years on, I feel much less positive about the world. But at that moment, we felt that anything could happen. And I think those were a lot of the formative experiences.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. So, for all the travelling that you have done, and you talk about how the old male fellows and stuff, and was there a defining moment in your childhood where you went, gender relations is an issue that you were passionate about, and, did that motivate your intentions to study law at university?
No, I think there wasn't. And the reason there wasn't, because I really had very few restrictions on my life. And the one thing I was very certain of, as I said, my father's a very senior constitutional lawyer and politician, and so I was very certain I was never going to do constitutional law. And all through my teenage years, I would say, I am not studying law, absolutely not, no way, nothing doing. And then I don't know what happened. I went in, I did study law, but the thing that really made me decide to become a lawyer, I think, was not all of that, but I spent a summer internship. This is my time to do a quick pitch to everybody. Come and do an internship in Bangladesh and work on legal rights. I did do a summer internship in Bangladesh with a small legal aid organization, not the one I work in now, so this is not a blatant pitch, but in southwest Bangladesh, a very little known organization, but called Madaripur Legal Aid Association, which kind of pioneered legal aid in Bangladesh and also pioneered engaging lawyers to provide their time free of charge to do legal representation and other things. And I think going there is what made me realize, it didn't really make me think so much about gender equality, but it made me think very differently about how you could use the law in very creative ways.
Thanks for sharing, Sara. I have relatives who live in Madaripur, so it's very interesting to hear that they'll have somewhere to go if they need legal assistance, or at least they had a place to go to. In your personal journey, has being a woman ever held you back?
Again, I would say not really. And I think I've been very privileged, and I really don't think it has held me back. And I think in many ways, I can think the only thing, I guess when I was your age and I was a lawyer, and I would show up in courts, and it could have held me back because there was a lot of kind of like, are you a lawyer, really, seriously, from judges? And there was another issue, I think, which was very irritating, which was endlessly being asked in Bangladesh about, are you married and how many children do you have? And I used to get really flustered. I wouldn't say it held me back, but it really irritated me a lot, and perhaps did hold me back by resulting in unnecessary conflicts with lots of people. But after about 10 or 20 of these, I think I learned the lesson, which was to say, yeah, I am, and I've got 5 kids. And they'll be like, oh, okay, no more questions. And that was the best way of dealing with that problem. So.
Thank you for sharing that humorous anecdote. You spoke about Bangladesh being in 50 years of independence, and judging from events of this week, independence is no easy matter. I'm wondering, could you share maybe from your perspective what you consider the biggest accomplishments, especially in terms of human rights protection in Bangladesh in the last 50 years?
I think there have been many. I've spoken very bleakly earlier about some of the challenges we face today, but I think it's really important to reflect on the fact that in 50 years, Bangladesh has transformed itself as a country and as a society, and that there are extraordinary opportunities for people in Bangladesh now. So, this notorious statement was made by Henry Kissinger in 1972 or 73, describing Bangladesh as a basket case and, a country that had no possibilities in front of it at all. Whereas now, 50 years later, we'll say all the extraordinary things that Bangladesh has progressed from being one of the least developed countries to being a middle-income country. Bangladesh now is the second highest exporter of ready-made garments anywhere in the world. We have huge remittances coming from the Bangladeshis who are all over the world, in the UK, the US, in the Middle East, in the Far East, working in all manner of different occupations and professions. And I think really importantly, in terms of the kind of society we have, albeit we have all of these other constraints and challenges, we have now better socioeconomic indicators than many states in India. As you have more women in the workplace in Bangladesh than in many states in India. You have a higher lifespan. You have better access to water and clean water and sanitation. You have n number of things that have definitely improved in the country. In terms of human rights issues, I would think the one that I feel really is important for us now is a recognition of diversity. It's been very late coming, but it's when we became independent in '71, as I said, it was against the backdrop of the Pakistan state, of having been part of the Pakistan state and identity being defined in terms of, an Islamic state and a Muslim identity. So the new Bangladesh tried to identify itself very differently in terms of being a secular country which respected, religious belief and those who didn't believe in any particular religion. But one area where I think, which also came out of our history, was about defining ourselves as a sort of majoritarian ethnic Bengali nation. And I think one place where we've really progressed in 50 years is to see that we came out of that sense of Bengali nationhood, but now that we recognize with a lot of reluctance, perhaps in some cases, that we are a diverse nation. So there are Bengalis and non-Bengalis who live there. There are indigenous communities, however small, who are part of that same nation and who can claim to be Bangladeshis. And I think we also, again, perhaps slowly and reluctantly, as I said, but are recognizing other forms of identity and diversity as well. So, for example, the Hijra community, who are a very particular, cultural group across South Asia, have been officially recognized as a separate community by the government. And that in its wake has brought discussions now in Bangladesh around whether there can be respect for different gender identities as well. As I said, it's not officially recognized, but there's a space that's been created for that conversation to start happening. There is official state recognition of special protections and recognition of disability, for example. There is, of course, in terms of the presence of the Rohingya community in Bangladesh, refugees who've been pushed out of Myanmar by the horrific genocide that's occurred there as well. There is, in that sense, de facto recognition that Rohingyas are also entitled to rights and protection in Bangladesh, even as non-citizens. So I think that's one of the biggest achievements, is recognizing that in this, majority Bengali, majority Muslim nation, that there are many other different identities and that they have to be recognized.
That's wonderful and beautiful to hear the progresses. So in 2010, the Bangladeshi government passed the Domestic Violence Prevention and Protection Act, and you obviously played quite a key role in drafting it. So looking back, 12 years have passed. Do you think it has also made progress, and in what parts have the laws fallen short?
I think it's made progress in that before that law, we didn't really have we didn't recognize domestic violence as a separate a situation. We only recognized what was called dowry violence, that if someone was demanding payments of dowry at the time of marriage, like a huge payment of money at the time of marriage, and someone committed violence in the context of that, that would be recognized an offense. The second thing that law did was it brought in place all kinds of civil protections. So if you're facing domestic violence, you can get a protection order against the person. It could be your husband, it could be a father, it could be an uncle, it could be someone else in your family. You could get a residence order, protection order, maintenance order, all kinds of things. In terms of how it's been used in all these 10 years or more that we've had it, it's been used much less than it should be, and part of the challenges, I think, are that we don't have in place all of the other things that you need to have in place for a domestic violence law to work. So in England, for example, if you face domestic violence, you not only can get court-ordered protections, you can get emergency housing, you can get emergency income support, you can get the police to intervene to ensure protections when it's needed. Those things are not in place in Bangladesh in the same way. You cannot get emergency housing. You're reliant on your family to have somewhere to go. There's still a lot of stigma around domestic violence, so families will still push you back into a violent relationship often, rather than protecting you. Things are changing, but not sufficiently. So I think that maybe where we fell very short in terms of working on that legislation for all of it, and it certainly wasn't me alone, there were many groups that worked on it, we didn't think enough about all of the kind of structural changes that you need to have in place for a law to really work, that it can't be enough just to magic up a bit of law and then everything else will fall into place.
Focusing a bit more on the gender politics or the challenges facing the advocacy of gender-based rights. In a Guardian article back in 2011, you mentioned, "Fatwa is an opinion, not a decision." Fatwa, to be very brief, is often a religious ruling that can outline certain consequences for individuals who are perceived or have committed a crime according to those who are issuing that fatwa. Some might argue that fatwas are actually part of a culture, and ideas of secular criminal law are disrespectful to their cultural identity or a form of Western influence. Have you encountered these arguments in your work, and how have you responded to them?
Yeah, we had exactly that argument in the case, actually. Maybe I should, so it doesn't sound too weird to you all, I should maybe explain a little bit of what this is about. So who's heard of fatwas or has some idea what they are? Hands up, high. Pretty much everybody, right? Okay. So in our context, what fatwas are being understood as from the sort of early 90s on is if there's some kind of, not really a dispute even, but I guess a kind of policing of people's personal behavior and also sexual behaviors, you would find these situations occurring usually in villages where maybe there was someone involved in a relationship outside marriage, for example, or before marriage. And let's say a girl and boy are going out, have a sexual relationship, girl becomes pregnant, suddenly the family discover this has happened, and she kind of gets denounced to the community. And some village elders will issue a decision on what should be done, and that would be called a fatwa, saying that she should be subjected to some, usually she, not he, would be subjected to some kind of violent kind of chastising or punishment. It could be very strange things like hanging a garland of shoes around her neck or ostracizing her from the village, or in some cases, hitting her with a stick, throwing pebbles at her, and so on. So these stories basically came into the media. Again, organizations, women's rights groups, human rights groups all got very active, investigated them, took action on them. And ultimately, they were challenged in courts as well on the basis that they were clearly humiliating and degrading punishments, and these village elders had no right to impose these punishments on anyone. And in fact, neither premarital sex nor extramarital sex are criminal offenses in Bangladesh anyway. But when we took this case forward, and the courts actually initially said, yeah, these kinds of fatwas, they came out with a very blanket order saying all fatwas are completely illegal and no one can issue these kinds of fatwas. Several people came forward and said, we have a fundamental right to issue fatwas because we believe that fatwas are expressions of opinion, and as Muslims, we should have a right to have an expression of opinion based on Muslim law. And those people who are scholars in Muslim law should have the right to issue these opinions. And they got basically a basis to come to the court to argue their position. And because that was a kind of pernicious argument, but potentially quite a dangerous argument, we took some very well thought out legal strategy, which was to try and make sure this case didn't get heard for the next 10 years. And 10 years later, when an incident, a terrible incident happened where a 14-year-old girl was subjected to one of these fatwas and died as a result of actually being publicly whipped as the punishment that was issued to her after one of these fatwas was issued, we then went to court to see if this case could be heard. And this sounds a bit cold-blooded, but because that time was chosen in that kind of way, the court then, and the whole country was obviously in shock with this incident that had happened, and the court immediately responded by saying, we're going to hear this case, but the first thing we want to hear from everybody involved in this case, including those two people who got involved, was that we all agreed that under no circumstances can any fatwas ever be given which involve a punishment being given to somebody, far less a degrading punishment of this kind. And so those guys had to concede right away that they can give opinions and accept opinions, but these opinions can never take the form of a punishment. So I think that was where it went. And as a result of that case, ultimately, the courts also came up with a much finer understanding where they said that so long as it's an opinion and you have the choice whether you can accept it or not accept it, that's fine. But you can't go beyond an opinion to impose a decree. And if you remember the fatwa, I'm sure none of you will remember it, but I'm sure you read about it, the famous fatwa on Salman Rushdie that was given way back when by Ayatollah Khomeini, that came in a very different way, right? Very much as a decree that should be carried out by any any believing Muslim, according to them, around the world. So that was a very different kind of idea of a fatwa from the one in which, from the kind that was being used in Bangladesh. And I guess the key point to make about that was, fatwas being an instrument of Sharia law or Muslim personal law are not the same thing everywhere around the world. It depends what legal system you're in, what credence and what importance will be given to that fatwa.
In the same Guardian article, it was mentioned that BLAST, the legal services organization you're involved with or where you are honorary director, the article mentioned that up to 80% of the issues that BLAST was dealing with was regarding issues of personal law, family law. Is there any reason why the legal system is unable to fill this gap and there's need for extra assistance?
Yeah, I think 80% of the cases actually are of women facing domestic violence, and 80% of the cases are actually women making economic claims. So it's women who've either been separated or women who've been divorced who are not being paid their maintenance by their husbands. And as I mentioned earlier, where there's no real recourse to state funds, so there's no income support, for example, that you can receive. So simply for survival, you have to go back either to court or to some kind of mediation to make sure you can get that basic payment in so that you can survive and you can support your children. And that's the most, as I said, we do lots of other things, but those are the majority of cases that we do. And the government also provides legal support in those cases, but I think the reason that organizations like BLAST and other non-governmental organizations that do this work get a lot of clients in is because we not only have lawyers in the courts, but we have a lot of so-called paralegals who are working on the ground and in communities that they can reach out to more easily.
Sara, I'd like to talk a bit more about your international experiences. And do you think that, in the international arena, do you see the differences between different jurisdictions, cultures, traditions as a barrier to achieving justice, or is it an opportunity as we head into, the 2020s?
I think it's a huge opportunity. I think some of the ways that we can progress rights and justice is by learning from each other. And learning about not only about laws and the framing of rights, but also about the kind of practices and procedures that apply in different contexts. So I think that the differences can be about learning. I was talking earlier about these rules around social media, for example. It's a really live issue because we're involved in debates right now in Bangladesh on this, and it's been a really critical place where learning from what's happening, because the world we're all in social media space at the same time, but we're dealing with very different kinds of challenges and contexts. So learning from each other on these things is really something that is helpful. And seeing the different places we are, the different trajectories we're in, also means that we can learn more from people who are a little bit further ahead on certain things than those who are in other places.
Yeah. Sara, we have you for so little time and want to ask for your opinion on a variety of issues, but we have to be picky. And so the final question I'll ask before handing it off to the audience is about judicial independence. In an article in the Routledge Handbook of South Asian Politics, you said that the most crucial change needed in Bangladesh, I should add, and I quote, will require the cultivation of independence of mind and spirit, immune to any kind of influence, whether from partisan political forces or other powerful actors or agencies. 12 years since the article, do you believe that the situation has changed with regards to cultivating that independence of mind that we so desperately need? If not, what's holding us back?
I think you have to give a very circumspect answer on this. We have really very draconian laws on contempt of court, so I'm not going to go too much into that. Yeah, I think it's a mixed bag. Of course, there is definitely independence of mind and spirit, not only in bits of the judiciary, but outside. But unfortunately, there's a great deal of the opposite as well, and I guess Bangladesh is not alone in that. There's a lot of doublespeak, there's a lot of cronyism, there's a lot of people speaking in a very opportunistic way, but none of that will be unfamiliar to you here in England either, right? Looking at high officials. So I guess Bangladesh is not alone in that world. And I can say more about it outside a chamber in more private conversation.
Well, Sara mentioned about diversity and finding opportunities and differences, and we'd like you to engage. And if you got any questions, please put up your hand. Yes, please.
Good evening. My name is Kavita, and I'm a lawyer from India. My question concerns the democratic process that is there. In a world where we see that democratic processes are now being used to consolidate plutocratic power, what do we mean by government of the people, by the people, and for the people, as per you, given that your father was also one of the persons who drafted the Constitution of Bangladesh? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really good question. It's even more difficult to explain what that means in a context where you don't necessarily have very contested elections happening. So I think that not only that, but I think where you see erosion of democratic institutions as well. I mean, you asked this question about the judiciary, but other guardian institutions as well, whether it's parliament or the judiciary, we don't see that kind of robust debate, and we particularly don't see, I think, the process of consultation with the people or respect for people's voices. In fact, quite the obverse, right? Not only in Bangladesh, but certainly right across the subcontinent and perhaps more widely, we see a kind of real rejection at the moment. Maybe, I mean, led by Mr. Putin and others, this total rejection of civil society voices and the notion that, the citizenry or civil society has any contribution to make. And I think this kind of glorification of the state is, I guess, going to the question you're asking. I mean, I think I agree with you that we can't really understand the idea of government of and by the people in the same way that we did, because it's about exclusion and it's about silencing a lot, rather than, in fact, inclusion and participation. I mean, I'm just reflecting on a development in Bangladesh today that our new election commission has just been constituted, and there was a long process of asking for people's nominations and so on from people at large. The major political parties all boycotted the process due to lack of, I guess, trust and confidence in the system. And the names that have finally come out, I won't comment on any of the names except to say that all of the individuals concerned are from essentially bureaucratic backgrounds and one person from the judiciary, no one who comes from any other arena of public life. And I guess that kind of represents that sort of understanding of complete lack of confidence from those in power and in state authorities in their counterparts in civil society. And I think that can only be about reducing, contributing to the democratic deficit and not building it. Not a very positive answer, but...
Your speech today was very interesting. My parents are from Sylhet, and I was just wondering if you think there is a difference in reception of these discrimination laws and inequalities that you're talking about across the country, like, for example, within...
Okay, so you'll have to speak up, yeah.
Oh, sorry. I'll repeat what I was saying. So my parents are from Sylhet, and I was just wondering if you think there's a difference in reception between, how different regions within the country react to the sort of discrimination laws that you're talking about. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think there is a difference, and although Sylhet is an extraordinary region in Bangladesh in terms of contributing to perhaps the largest diaspora Bangladesh has in much of the world, but certainly in this country, it's still, in Bangladesh itself, it's still a very conservative area. So there is a real difference, I think, in terms of how not only issues around discrimination, and particularly gender discrimination, but in terms of conservatism in general and not recognizing all kinds of rights. So one of the issues I guess I've worked on a lot over the years is around forced marriage and choice of marriage. And unfortunately, a large number of the cases, including many involving British Bangladesh nationals, are from the Sylhet region and not so much from other areas. So I think, yeah, there is a difference, but I think it's also changing, right? So partly informed by a very dynamic second generation or third generation diaspora, but also informed by changes within Bangladesh. So there are some, the most recent thing that's been happening in Sylhet is the university, one of the leading universities in Sylhet. There's been a huge movement there over the last few weeks by students, protesting various acts to do with the administration, but there's a sort of lively, active, dynamic student presence, and those things will also change the kind of more traditional, conservative social dynamics there, I think.
Hi, thank you very much for coming to speak this evening. I saw Before coming, I read that you'd been appointed by the UN to investigate human rights abuses in Korea and in Palestine, and I just wanted to know kind of like in general how that was and what you found, and whether you think kind of the UN is capable of preventing or prosecuting these human rights abusers, and if not them, then what kind of channel could be used to stop it?
So that's a very tiny question. Let me make a stab at it. So I had the opportunity to work on two issues. One was around, one was a follow-up to a commission of inquiry that was set up on gross human rights violations in North Korea. And our body was called a group of experts, which was looking at issues of accountability in relation to those violations. That body was set up towards the end of the Obama period, when the US was really kind of hot on the heels of trying to follow up on this particular commission of inquiry set of quite horrific findings about the violations occurring within North Korea. But the accountability mechanisms that we were exploring were the possibilities of prosecution through the International Criminal Court, or prosecution through the International Court of Justice, or the possibility of prosecutions in different national jurisdictions of those involved with the violence, so basically of the regime in North Korea. In terms of the end bit of your question about how realistic was that and what was it likely to lead to, by the time we were concluding our mandate and providing our kind of final recommendations, the Obama era was almost over. And within the UN, I would say the US had been a big driving force of that particular mandate. And by the end of it, they had pretty much thrown in the towel as Trump was coming in, decided nothing was going to work in terms of international law anymore, and they just didn't have the wherewithal to take it any further. And I have to say that from that mandate, our own feeling also was that the focus couldn't simply be on prosecutions at the ICC, and it had to deal with the very real, with the ongoing daily realities that many North Koreans are facing. And we had to deal with those challenges and the fact that South Korea, at that point there was a very right-wing government in South Korea, which also was very hard on just prosecute them and nothing else to be done. Political changes also happened in South Korea over the next year or two. If you remember the whole movement against the president, and then the current South Korean government that came in had a very different approach of entering into some kind of dialogue and trying to open up a space and so on. So that mandate went in a very different direction. I would say the UN accountability process didn't go anywhere, and the political process in the US that was pushing the mandate, and in South Korea that was the immediate neighbor of North Korea, and obviously historically and culturally incredibly tied, determined what the outcomes were. So in short order, I don't think it made much difference in terms of what the mandate was about. The second mandate I worked on was the Commission of Inquiry on the Gaza protests, on the killings at the wall, the shootings at the wall. And that, I think, did have an impact, because at least it had an immediate impact, because when we reported on the findings, and the findings were essentially that people including children, people with disabilities, journalists, women, and health workers, all of whom are protected categories under international law, all of them were being shot at, point-blank range in many cases, without any mitigation or without any effective defenses in place for those who were doing it. So after that Commission of Inquiry report was out, we did see in the immediate months afterwards a reduction in shootings and fatalities on the wall. So I think that had its own impact. And in fact, going back to what we were discussing about social media, what I was saying rather about social media earlier, one of the things that really helped us in that mandate was the fact that we could rely on on essentially citizen journalists, people who were at the protests, who were being able to send in mobile phone footage of what they were seeing, and also the fact that we had social media experts who were able to extract a whole lot of evidence from the kind of information that was being posted. So I think that had a real-world impact. And then a very last, very long-winded response to admittedly complex question, is that, again, looking at the Ukraine, we might feel, what can the UN do? I mean, Russia is going to veto any resolution being on the Security Council. But the UN is not only the Security Council, and the UN is something to which we have no alternative. So however futile it may seem at the moment, it is the only space we have for any kind of multilateral dialogue or process to happen. So however, as I said, frustrating it may seem, even when you're working within it, and certainly when you're looking at it from outside, we don't have an alternative. And I think we have to work with it and keep that, engage that multilateral space, even when the kind of horrors occurring that we're seeing at the moment.
I'm going to be greedy and steal the very last question, Sara. From your earlier remarks as well as our conversation, it's been clear that human rights is not an easy right to achieve or easy aspect of human life to really establish, at least for good. It's full of, as you mentioned, struggle, contestations, and it's a thorny path. So how do you approach these difficulties and stay hopeful despite the setbacks and the many challenges?
By winning some of the cases, that always helps. But I think most importantly, seeing it as a process. And I think what, David, you were saying earlier, I mean, thinking about your work in a much broader context, so that you're part of working. I mean, I think for me anyway, the things that really make it possible to carry on, even when it gets very depressing and miserable, is there are many other people doing much harder things alongside one all the time. So there's always a community, and that's really important. And I think knowing other people are fighting similar battles. I know friends in India are fighting much harder ones some of the time. And I think perhaps knowing that things have not been easy for people in the past makes you a bit more optimistic, right? People face much worse things. As I said, our childhood was not knowing whether we'd be ever able to go back to Bangladesh, knowing that, someone who was the most powerful person had been destroyed and murdered along with his whole family. So knowing those kinds of realities, I think puts everything into context, and you can see a future more positively.
Thank you so much for sharing, Sara. I'm sure we could talk hours about it, but our event managers actually got important matters to attend to, so we are going to have to cut it short here. But I just want to firstly take this opportunity to acknowledge Kate for putting in a lot of work. And a lot of people don't understand how we bring in speakers, but it's a lot of text messages and emails, and Sara would attest that she would have got hundreds of text messages from Kate alone, and that was all during, the Christmas holidays, the New Year's. And I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge my committee, because they've worked really, really hard, and sometimes I feel guilty because I'm the one taking the credit, but they've put in so much work. And thank you, Kate, for organising this great talk. And of course, Sara, we're so grateful that you have decided to come here and to spend your time with us, and the insights that you've shared. I think we can all take something away that's very valuable. And on that note, can we all give Sara a very warm round of applause? Thank you.